At exactly 05:03 a.m. on September 6, 2025, 10 ghostly blips floated 57 seconds from a point no drone was ever supposed to touch. Just under a kilometer away, the Zaporizhzhia Nuclear Power Plant, the largest in Europe, loomed like a sleeping giant under Russian control. The complex was so high risk, so politically radioactive, that the very idea of attacking it had become taboo. The soldiers stationed there had started to believe in its untouchability, lulled into arrogance by the assumption that no sane enemy would dare strike so close to a nuclear core. But this wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a misfire. This was a surgical strike by design, and it was already in motion. On the Ukrainian operator's dusty laptop screen, the grainy live feed from the lead drone flickered to life. Through a pixelated camera, the operator could see the target. Not a reactor, not a power line, but the ZNPP's prized simulation and training center, a multi-million-dollar brain of the facility where Russian engineers were trained to avoid another Chernobyl. Not an attack on the reactor itself. This was smarter, deadlier, and more permanent. It wasn't about causing a meltdown, it was about removing Russia's ability to prevent one. 9 miles away in a bunker so crude it was wired with extension cords from a backup generator, a Ukrainian technician guided the entire swarm with a battered keyboard and a 5.88 GHz frequency hopping signal. The operator looked like a college dropout, but he was guiding a plan of strategic genius, coordinating the ballet of destruction that had taken 3 months to script and just minutes to execute. His signal? A whisper in a hurricane. It shifted frequencies 1,000 times per second, bouncing through the air like a ghost slipping past Russian defenses. On his map, the ZNPP didn't look like a power station. It looked like a fortress, shielded by layers of weaponry, jammers, and radar systems that made it, on paper, invincible. But Ukraine didn't plan to fly over the wall. They planned to swim under it. The first move didn't come from the air. It came from below the surface of the Dnipro River. At precisely 04:30 a.m., under the cover of thick morning fog, a civilian fishing boat drifted silently toward a predetermined point in the reeds. No engines, no lights, just the steady rhythm of oars and the breath of the men on board. Then, like a crocodile slipping beneath a still swamp, the Maritska autonomous underwater vehicle slid off the side and disappeared beneath the surface. It was silent, slow, unseen. For the next 30 minutes, the Maritska glided through the murky waters like a mechanical predator, hugging the riverbed, its carbon composite skin invisible to radar and sonar. At that moment, nobody in Russian-occupied Inner Hodar knew a war machine was slithering through the water just miles away from the most sensitive site in Europe. But the quiet wouldn't last. At 04:55 a.m., the sky cracked open. 2 Neptune missiles, launched from concealed Ukrainian platforms near Zaporizhzhia, roared toward their target. But the plant wasn't what they were after. Their objective was a BM-30 Smerch, a Russian multiple rocket launcher positioned near the facility. To the untrained eye, it was just a big truck with tubes. But to the Ukrainian operator, it was a steel shotgun loaded with death. If those tubes fired, they'd shred the drone swarm mid-air with 1,000 tungsten claws. Ukraine didn't want a fair fight. They wanted no fight at all. So they took the shotgun off the table first. The missiles struck with brutal precision. In seconds, the Smerch ceased to exist. Nothing left but a smoldering crater and a scrambled Russian response team. Sirens screamed. Radios erupted. Russian commanders scrambled for answers. And while the smoke still hung in the air, the second phase began. Inside Enerhodar, 5 shadows moved through alleyways and backyards. Ukrainian Special Forces operatives, codenamed Ghost Team, had been living inside Russian territory for weeks. Disguised as workers, neighbors, delivery drivers, their mission wasn't sabotage, it was silence. Armed with nothing more than bolt cutters, jammers, and nerves of steel, they moved toward the anti-drone netting surrounding the ZNPP. Webs of crude fencing designed to snare incoming UAVs. Like safecrackers in a digital vault, they used short-range jammers to momentarily blind security sensors and cut a precise opening just 2 meters wide. It was barely enough, but barely was all they needed. At 05 sharp, the Maritska surfaced in a pre-scouted patch of reeds, exactly 3.1 miles from the training center. The river was still, the fog thick, no lights, no movement, just a quiet hiss as the waterproof hatch cracked open. 10 KHS-7 drones rose into the air like a murder of crows, each one barely 1.5 pounds, carbon fiber skeletons wrapped around a 3.3-pound shaped charge warhead. Small, cheap, and deadly. 8 of them immediately dropped low, hugging the terrain at 130 feet, dipping beneath radar clutter, but 2 shot high, climbing boldly to 500 feet with dummy warheads and loud visible profiles. To a Russian radar tech watching his screen, it was obvious, too obvious. He had no idea he was looking at bait. The trap was set. The S-400 Triumph air defense system is supposed to be invincible. It's the pride of Russia's air shield, capable of locking onto 300 aerial targets at once and erasing them from the sky with surgical precision. Each missile it launches costs more than an American house. It was built to kill bombers, to defend borders, to enforce fear. But on that morning, it was staring down 2 decoys, and it had no idea. High above the battlefield, the 2 dummy KHS-7 drones blinked brightly on radar. They flew slow, wide, and high, daring, obvious, deliberate. A move any amateur could spot. And that was the genius. The S-400 was programmed to swat down threats. These 2 drones screamed threat. And they were. Just not in the way the operator imagined. What the system didn't see, couldn't see, were the 7 real killers gliding silently below, barely above treetop level. Camouflaged by their size. Cloaked by design. Each drone had the radar profile of a small bird. In fact, the S-400's filtering algorithm was specifically designed to ignore anything under a certain size threshold. Otherwise, it would waste million-dollar missiles on Sparrows. That morning, the Russians didn't know the Sparrows had evolved. The KHS-7 wasn't just another drone. It was the product of wartime desperation and technical brilliance. Each one carried a Jetson Nano AI chip, the same kind used in high school robotics competitions. But here, in this war zone, that chip was rewriting the rules of modern combat. First, it ran a complex frequency-hopping communication algorithm, shifting the drone's signal thousands of times a second to stay ahead of the Russian Kasuka-4 electronic warfare system. That system, truck-mounted, angry, and deafening, jammed everything in a 186-mile radius. GPS, gone. RF signals, drowned. But the Jetson didn't care. It didn't need GPS. It had eyes. Each drone used optical navigation, comparing the terrain it saw with satellite maps hard-coded into its memory. If the ground looked like a specific stretch of road, it adjusted course. If a building matched a known image, it corrected altitude. They weren't listening for instructions. They were reading the landscape. And the landscape couldn't be jammed. The drones themselves were feather-light, their carbon fiber skeletons weighing barely more than a bottle of water. That meant the lithium polymer battery didn't waste power lifting the drone. It used everything on flight range and AI processing. With no external guidance needed, they were self-guided knives in the dark. Back in the bunker in Orikhiv, the Ukrainian operator watched as the S-400 did exactly what it was supposed to. It reacted. 2 missiles were fired. Explosions split the dawn sky as the decoys were annihilated mid-air. From the Russian side, it looked like a victory. The operator Sergei called in the kill. 2 targets down. Threat neutralized. He didn't know the real swarm was now inside the wire, but the illusion was starting to fray. High above, an Orlan 10 surveillance drone caught sight of something strange. Distortion on the video feed from the decoys. A flicker. A static blur. Not enough to confirm more drones, but enough to make someone nervous. Command ordered Sergei to lower his radar beam to scan beneath the altitudes where birds fly and bombs drop, to sweep the floor of the sky. That's when Sergei's heart rate ticked up, because there on the fringe of his scan something moved. 7 somethings. On the operator's map back in Orikhiv, a cold chill ran down his spine. His drones were about to be seen. The sweep was seconds away from finding them. The S-400 scythe was lowering, and that's when the Ghost team in Enerhodar made their final move. At 052 and 40 seconds, just as the S-400's radar sweep edged dangerously close to the hidden swarm, one of the Ghost team operators in Enerhodar pulled a small, nondescript black box from his backpack. It looked like a car battery with a handle, but it wasn't. It was a short-range counter-EW disruptor, a reverse jammer not built to block the enemy signal but to twist it, mimic it, and poison it. Instead of yelling louder than the Kasuka-4's thunderous broadcast, it whispered nonsense right into its ear. The result was chaos. For Sergei watching from his control station, the radar feed glitched. Not completely, but just enough. The lines began to tremble. A false echo appeared. The sharp S-curve of the radar beam blurred. His console was speaking gibberish. He squinted, confused. His hand hovered over the interface. And then, right on cue, his 2 missiles connected with the decoys, triggering a fiery detonation high above the plant. On the Russian command network, cheers erupted. 2 drones down. Threat eliminated. Sergei exhaled. He thought he'd won. He had no idea that 7 assassins had just slipped beneath his feet, invisible, autonomous, and alive. At 05:03, they reached the final perimeter. That's when the real nightmare began. From the Russian perspective, it wasn't a drone strike anymore. It was a hostage crisis. But the hostage wasn't a human. It was Europe's largest nuclear facility.
Suddenly, the incoming flight paths were too close to reactor containment buildings, too close to the simulation center, too close to everything labeled "Do Not Miss." Standard engagement protocols collapsed. Every Russian gunner from the Pantsir turrets to the Mi-28 Havoc helicopter pilot overhead was faced with a question no one wants to answer. Can you take the shot without triggering a nuclear incident? Inside the control tower, Sergei's voice was no longer calm. He was yelling, "Firing solutions must be clear of all reactor lines. No stray fire." Outside, the chaos was spreading. Pantsir turrets frantically traversed their cannons trying to find a clean angle. The Mi-28 pilot's fingers trembled as he adjusted his run, angling away from the reactors to avoid catastrophic risk. Even with all that firepower, they were being forced to hesitate, and that split second of hesitation was all the Ukrainians needed. But the Russians weren't sleeping anymore. One Pantsir turret found a gap and fired. Burst after burst of shrapnel-filled air shattered the silence. One drone down, then another. The Mi-28 now angled perfectly opened fire with its autocannon. Another kill. Seconds later, a second Pantsir turret picked off two more with short, brutal bursts. In under 10 seconds, the sky was on fire, and 5 of the drones were gone. In Orikhiv, the Ukrainian operator stared at his screen in disbelief. His swarm, his perfect plan was being erased. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Static, static, static. But one feed remained. Drone 7 was still alive. The last drone hadn't flown a direct route. It had zigzagged erratically through the gaps, using the destruction of its siblings as a moving wall of smoke and confusion. The operator guiding it had flown like a madman with improvisation, guts, and instinct sharpened by months of simulation. He'd memorized every square inch of the target building, and he knew exactly where he had to go. Now, as tracer fire lit up the morning sky and Russian eyes turned elsewhere, the lone survivor dropped to just 60 feet, skimming the concrete like a shadow. Its destination wasn't a rooftop or a vent fan. It was a black square no larger than a pizza box, a third-floor ventilation louver on the southwest side of the simulation center. From the camera's perspective, it looked like a speck of shadow against a wall of steel, but to the operator, it was the keyhole to the entire operation. He inhaled, adjusted. On screen, a small icon blinked. Warhead armed. Entering structure, he whispered. The camera feed became a blur of metal and shadows as the drone slipped into the tight angular throat of the vent. The transition was instant. From open sky to claustrophobic darkness, the drone was now flying blind, squeezed between steel ductwork barely wider than its own wingspan. There was no GPS, no visual markers, just memory. The operator had spent months memorizing every turn, every bend, every twist in that ventilation system. He had studied blueprints like a surgeon studies a nervous system, until he could trace the route in his sleep. Left, then right, a quick dip, then a vertical climb through a narrow junction box. The drone buzzed through the blackness like a guided thought, its AI chip making micro-adjustments to avoid the razor edges of aluminum sheeting. Sparks flew as its propellers nicked a corner, but it stayed on course. Then at 05:03 and 43 seconds, the feed broke into open space. The camera's night vision bloomed wide, revealing a small room lined with racks of humming electronics, servers, power converters, the digital heart of Russia's $50 million simulation center. The warhead didn't detonate on impact. This wasn't that kind of weapon. It was a shaped charge, designed not for fireballs but for precision. The operator made a tiny correction. Just a nudge, just enough. Then he whispered, calm and surgical, confirming target, final push. A quiet digital click echoed in his headset. The camera feed turned white, then static. Outside, on the Russian side, there was no explosion, no shockwave, no visible flash, just a soft thump and a faint puff of black smoke bleeding from the third-floor vent. And then the lights inside the simulation center flickered once, twice, then died, permanently. Sergei stared at his radar feed, confused. The last drone hadn't been destroyed. It had simply vanished. No impact, no debris, no signal, just gone. He reported nothing, but he already knew. Deep down he knew. In the silence that followed, there was only dread. Here's what happened inside. The shaped charge didn't explode outward. It focused all of its energy into a narrow jet of molten copper traveling at 25,000 feet per second. It cut through the reinforced server wall like a surgeon's scalpel through gauze. Then it sliced through the core power conduit, vaporized the server array, and severed the simulation center's digital nervous system in a single perfect blow. There were no secondary fires, no collateral damage, just darkness. Within hours, satellite images confirmed the damage. Russian state media issued no statement. Russian military forums went silent. There was nothing to say. The simulation center, designed to train every Russian technician to safely operate the 6 VVR-1000 reactors, was now dark, charred, and offline. Intelligence estimates said the destruction was 80% complete. To rebuild it would cost over $60 million and take 18 months. 18 months without certification. 18 months without training. 18 months of risk. Ukraine didn't strike the plant, they struck its brain. And in doing so, they flipped the balance. All of it, every decoy, every frequency hop, every ounce of risk was pulled off with 10 drones that cost less than $400 each. 10 drones, less than the cost of a used car, against a billion-dollar fortress. And all it took was one getting through. So now ask yourself, if you were the mission planner, if the fate of your country's power grid, your people's safety, and your enemy's grip on Europe's largest nuclear plant rested in your hands, would you have approved that mission? Would you have risked a $400 drone flying just 984 feet from a nuclear core, gambling everything on one perfect flight path? Let us know your answer in the comments, because in the end, Ukraine didn't just outgun Russia, they outthought them. This wasn't a battle of missiles, it was a battle of minds, and the smarter mind won. If this kind of asymmetric chess match fascinates you, where intelligence, not brute force, turns the tide, hammer that like button. Share this story with anyone who still thinks wars are won with tanks, and subscribe to make sure you never miss the moment another Goliath gets taken down by a slingshot.